The motion before us, the art of war, 25 centuries old, endlessly cited, taught in business schools from Barcelona to Beijing, is not actually a strategic text at all, but wisdom literature. Its maxims are abstract enough to mean everything, and therefore precise enough to mean nothing. Its staying power reflects our appetite for ancient authority, not its operational use. At the table, the empiricist, who asks what we can know versus what we merely assert, and who will not proceed until the epistemological ground is solid. The geographer, who thinks through the particular, the named person in the specific place, because abstraction untethered from human detail is philosophy pretending to be analysis. The essayist, who watches what millions are actually doing and asks what the pattern reveals about what we have become. What is at stake is this: we live inside a civilization that cannot stop quoting Sun Tzu. Every strategy memo, every management book, every leadership seminar reaches for the same 5 maxims. Either we have discovered something genuinely portable across context, a real structure beneath surface difference, or we have mistaken portability for profundity. If the latter, then half the strategic thinking in the modern world is ceremonial, not operational. And if we cannot tell the difference, that is a problem worth naming. The empiricist will open.
The fundamental epistemological problem is this: we cannot distinguish between a principle that is universally applicable and one that is empirically empty. Consider what counts as evidence. When a venture capitalist says, "Sun Tzu taught me to know my terrain before I engage," what has actually occurred? Has a specific strategic principle generated a specific decision? Or has a general truth, understand your context before you act, been dressed in the costume of ancient authority? The costume does work, but what work exactly? Here is what we can observe. Major corporations invoke Sun Tzu in annual reports and strategy documents with some frequency. What we cannot observe is the counterfactual. Would those same decisions have been made without the citation? The honest answer is almost certainly yes. The maxim follows the decision. It does not precede it. Compare this to von Clausewitz, who gives you specific, falsifiable claims about the relationship between offense and defense, about the culminating point of victory, about friction and fog. You can test those. The 1982 Israeli operation in the Bekaa Valley, suppression of Syrian air defenses through coordinated electronic warfare and drone reconnaissance, vindicated Clausewitz's analysis of combined arms and the offense-defense balance in a way that can be studied in staff colleges with actual radiologs and kill ratios. That is operational utility. You can be wrong about Clausewitz in a way that costs you a battle. Can you be wrong about Sun Tzu? Know your enemy and know yourself. What specific decision does this rule out? What action does it forbid? If it forbids nothing, it commands nothing. It may be wise. Wisdom and strategy are not the same thing. The pattern we observe is this: Sun Tzu is cited most heavily in contexts where strategy has already succeeded or already failed, and an explanation is required. He appears in the narrative account, not the planning document. His maxims are tools of interpretation, not prediction. That is the function of wisdom literature. It helps us make sense of what has already happened. The test is simple. Show me a strategic decision with a specific date, a named actor, and an alternative they rejected that was caused by reading Sun Tzu rather than merely justified by quoting him afterward. If that distinction collapses, we are not doing strategy. We are doing something else.
The empiricist's definition of strategy is clean, orderly, and entirely confined to the map room. It presumes 2 armies of roughly similar composition, a shared understanding of victory, and a state with the capacity to project force. But for most of the world, and for most of history, the primary strategic problem is not how to defeat an opposing army. It is how to survive the conditions your geography has imposed on you. Consider the Sahel, where the Sahara advances southwards. The line on the map moves by several kilometers in a bad year. The strategic enemy is not a column of tanks, it is the hardening of the earth. In northern Burkina Faso, the soil is laterite, baked by the sun until it is nearly impermeable. When the brief rains come, the water simply sheets off into gullies, taking the topsoil with it. This is the strong point of the enemy. A direct assault planting seeds in this earth is a strategy for famine. A farmer named Yakuba Sawadago, near the village of Gourga, faced this problem in the 1980s after a series of devastating droughts. He did not read Clausewitz. It is unlikely he read Sun Tzu. He remembered and refined an ancient farming technique called zai. He did not try to plow the hard earth. He attacked its weakness. He spent the dry season digging thousands of small pits, roughly 10 to 15 centimeters deep. Into each pit, he put manure and compost. The termites, drawn by the organic matter, came and digested it, digging channels that further broke up the soil. When the rains arrived, the pits caught the water. They held it. This is not philosophy. This is a sequence of operational decisions. Do not attack the baked, unbroken plain. Create small, discrete pockets of manufactured weakness. Concentrate your resources there. Lure an ally, the termite, who can do the work you cannot. This is the essence of preparing the battlefield, of knowing the terrain. The result, 40 years on, is a forest of nearly 40 hectares with more than 60 species of trees in a place where almost nothing grew before. The water table has risen. The empiricist asks for a decision caused by the text. That is the wrong causal frame. It is like asking if a falling apple has read Newton. The text does not cause the strategy. It describes a pattern that works. The proof of its operational utility is not in a general's memoir, but in the soil moisture of a specific hectare of land in Burkina Faso. The strategy is real. The text is merely the notation. What both the host and the empiricist have missed is that the most effective strategies are not planned in rooms at all. They are grown. They are grown in response to conditions that no general staff anticipated and no text prescribed. The essayist is right that Sun Tzu endures, but wrong, I think, about the reason. It is not that humans need consolation. It is that the underlying logic, conserve your energy, exploit asymmetry, make the environment work for you, is genuinely structural. It describes how adaptation works. In 2004, Chris Rage at the VU Amsterdam documented the regreening of over 5 million hectares across Niger and Burkina Faso through exactly these farmer-led techniques. No doctrine, no citation. The same pattern reproduced independently across an area the size of Costa Rica. The empiricist wants a paper trail, but nature does not produce paper trails. I would ask the empiricist directly, if the same strategic pattern emerges independently across 5 million hectares in 30 years without anyone reading the text, what precisely does the text need to cause in order to count as useful? The proof of strategic logic is not found in the citation index. It is found in the navigational choices of a fishing community in the Marshall Islands, reading wave patterns on the underside of a canoe to locate land that no instrument has yet confirmed, a technique encoded not in any manual, but in the physical memory of how to read the sea.
Both positions rest on the premise that a text demonstrates its value only when it either causes a verifiable choice or captures a practice that would have arisen anyway. That premise leaves unexamined how such texts actually function once they circulate at scale. What millions of people are doing is purchasing and circulating short excerpts of Sun Tzu while simultaneously moving their planning work onto platforms that generate forecasts from data rather than from aphorisms. Corporate training platforms report that modules containing the familiar maxims remain among the most assigned, even as the same firms expand subscriptions to scenario modeling software and competitive intelligence dashboards. The excerpts travel through slide decks and email signatures. The software runs in the background. The two activities do not compete. They divide labor. The ancient phrases supply a shared shorthand that lets participants in different divisions or different companies describe an outcome as deception or weak point attack without first agreeing on metrics or methods. The quantitative tools then supply the numbers that justify or revise the same outcome after the fact. This division appears most clearly in the pattern of post-decision documentation. Annual reports and after-action memoranda now contain more references to classical maxims than they did 2 decades ago, yet the length and specificity of the quantitative appendices attached to those same documents have also grown. The maxims do not steer the numbers. They label them once the numbers exist. The labeling step is not ornamental. It converts a contingent result into a story that can be told to the next set of actors who were not present for the original calculation. Without that conversion, coordination across larger and more specialized organizations becomes costlier. Consider what happens when a phrase achieves sufficient familiarity that it no longer needs attribution. Legal scholars have documented an analogous process with Blackstone's formulations. The actual case law develops through precedent and statutory revision, but the Blackstone epigram attached to a judgment signals to every reader which tradition of reasoning the court is invoking, collapsing pages of genealogy into a single recognizable phrase. The maxim is not doing the jurisprudential work, it is doing the classificatory work that allows the jurisprudential work to be communicated efficiently across generations of practitioners who trained under different curricula. Sun Tzu's sentences function identically. A logistics director who writes "concentrate strength against the competitor's exposed flank" in a board presentation is not reporting that the classical text generated the insight. She is encoding a resource allocation decision that emerged from margin analysis into a vocabulary her audience will process without friction. The abstraction therefore performs a measurable service. It lowers the transaction cost of narrative alignment after uncertainty has already been resolved by other means. That service is invisible if one looks only for single decisions caused or rediscovered by the text. It becomes visible only when one watches how often the same handful of sentences reappear in documents whose actual evidentiary weight now rests elsewhere. You claim that one can be wrong about Clausewitz in a way that costs a battle, while Sun Tzu's maxims rule out no specific action. In the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, Israeli planners shifted from preemptive deep strikes to a deliberate holding defense once they observed that Egyptian forces had pre-positioned mobile anti-tank screens. What measurable change in equipment loss rates would have falsified the judgment that the terrain and enemy disposition presented strength rather than weakness? And why does that test not apply equally to Sun Tzu?
The question is exactly right, and it reveals where my claim was too clean. NATO's airland battle doctrine did contain explicit numerical triggers for the echelonment problem, specifically follow-on force ratios above which deep strike interdiction was mandated before close engagement. When Warsaw Pact second echelon densities crossed those thresholds in wargame or intelligence assessment, commanders could justify the transition to deep battle sequencing not by invoking attacking weakness, but by pointing to force ratio calculations that Corps' command had already validated. The falsification condition was written into the operational concept before the scenario began. Sun Tzu offers no such ratio. What is weak has no operational definition until after you have already decided whether to engage. Airland battle works precisely because the doctrine told you in advance what echelon density figure constitutes a vulnerability worth targeting. Sun Tzu's maxim becomes applicable only once you already know the answer. But here is the question you should be asking me. If the maxims merely label decisions made by other means, why does their presence in documentation correlate with higher rates of strategic revision in the same organizations over time? If they are post hoc narrative, they should stabilize interpretation. What if they are actually destabilizing it? The geographer is claiming that the text describes a pattern that works, but that move collapses two very different things: discovering a solution through trial and error and deriving one from a principle. Your Malian pastoralist who shifts grazing routes when rainfall fails, is he applying a principle about terrain and timing, or is he surviving through local knowledge that accumulates over generations? If the principle were genuinely portable, we should observe successful transfer of the Zai technique across similar ecologies at rates faster than word-of-mouth diffusion. We have data on this. Studies of agricultural diffusion in the Sahel suggest Zai spread gradually from its revival sites in Burkina Faso outward through neighboring communities, a pattern consistent with neighbor learning, not principal learning. Compare that to the diffusion of improved seed varieties in the same region, which moved substantially faster because agronomists could specify in advance which soil types and rainfall bands would support them. Here is the test your examples must pass. Can the farmer in Kenya predict, before digging, that the technique will work in his specific soil and rainfall regime? Or does he try it, observe, and adjust? If the latter, the principle is not guiding him. His local empiricism is. The maxim is a name for what worked, discovered afterward. Your Zai example is beautiful, but does it demonstrate strategic foresight or evolutionary luck that left survivors to tell the story?
You have caught me in an overstatement. The household responsibility system is not a blueprint, and your data on its slow diffusion is entirely correct. The principle is not a substitute for local knowledge. It is what directs it. In 1978, the central planning apparatus in China was the strong point, sclerotic but politically unassailable. The weakness was in Xiaogang village, Anhui province, where 18 farmers facing starvation signed a secret pact to divide their commune's land, risking their lives. Deng Xiaoping's strategic genius was not in devising this household responsibility system. It was in recognizing this desperate local act as the critical point of attack on the old order. He read the human geography and shielded the experiment. He could not predict its success with your precision. The principle told him where to look. Your test, can the farmer predict success before digging, is a demand for engineering, not strategy. Consider how the Wellington boot spread through Irish smallholder communities in the 1840s, not through agricultural ministry circulars announcing its drainage properties, but through one farmer watching a neighbor's field stay workable through a wet autumn. The adoption was tactile and local, but the underlying insight that waterlogged soil is the enemy of yield remained constant across every townland. A general does not need to predict the outcome of every skirmish. He needs to know which hill is the right one to fight for. The essayist speaks of a shared language for aligning intent inside a large firm. Let us test this language at its geographical limit. A corporate board in Wolfsburg decides to reroute a critical component through the port of Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico, citing a maxim on finding new avenues of approach. But the manager at the assembly plant in Puebla knows this route is controlled by a local cartel, which imposes an informal tax on every container. That tax does not appear on any dashboard in Germany. Does this shared language then function as a tool for strategic alignment, or as a dangerously elegant abstraction that allows the center to remain ignorant of the one detail on the ground that determines success or failure?
The geographer's example exposes the precise limit of the mechanism I described. The shared maxim lets the Enron Audit Committee ratify the special purpose vehicles without ever surfacing the mark-to-market exposure because the phrase asset-light strategy supplies a narrative that both sides can accept even while one side withholds the operative fact. That is not alignment, it is licensed ignorance. Yet the same organizations respond by routing the decisive detail through treasury desks and off-balance sheet subsidiaries that operate outside the maxim-laden documents entirely. The abstraction therefore coordinates the official account while execution migrates to channels that deliberately avoid it.
The question beneath the question is whether a strategic principle is something you apply before you act, or something you recognize after you survive. We are inside this right now. Ukraine's general staff cited Sun Tzu in briefings before Kharkiv, before Kherson, before the current grinding attrition in Donbass. Yet the actual decisions came from radio intercepts, mud depth, and which Russian units had functioning logistics. Silicon Valley pivoted en masse toward AI strategy 18 months ago, and every pivot deck contains the same maxim about adapting to terrain. Yet the firms that survived did so because they had cash reserves and existing contracts, not because they read the text more carefully. So, Empiricist, when a civilization reaches for the same ancient phrases at higher frequency precisely as its actual decision-making becomes more opaque and more algorithmic, what are we watching happen? Geographer, if the principle only becomes visible in hindsight, then the Ukrainian commander in Bakhmut, who holds one more day because the maxim told him this ground matters. Is he doing strategy, or is he dying well? An essayist, if the shared language now functions to coordinate ignorance rather than intent, are we still talking about transaction costs, or have we begun talking about the cost of remaining inside a system that can no longer name what it is actually doing?
The frequency of these citations has risen most sharply inside organizations whose actual planning now depends on models too large for any participant to audit end to end. Anecdotal reports and commentary from management consultants suggest that deliverables for corporate clients have increasingly incorporated classical maxims in executive summary sections in the years following the 2008 financial crisis, the same period when those firms expanded subscriptions to proprietary simulation platforms whose algorithms are updated quarterly by external vendors. Observations from organizational behavior researchers suggest that strategy documents generated by algorithmic platforms are rarely substantially revised by managers before implementation, and that appended rhetorical framing tends to persist through review cycles. A telling illustration emerges from the pharmaceutical sector, where merger documentation filed with regulators during the consolidation wave of the 2010s frequently opened with aphoristic framing drawn from classical sources, while the actual portfolio decisions were demonstrably driven by patent cliff modeling conducted by specialist actuarial teams whose outputs the signing executives had not personally constructed. A parallel movement appears in military staff colleges outside the United States. The Royal College of Defense Studies and its counterparts in Scandinavia and South Asia have expanded their curricula in quantitative and technical subjects over recent decades while continuing to include classical strategic text in their reading lists. The proportional increase in technical content has not displaced the ceremonial presence of ancient aphorism in assessed essays and staff appreciations. The pattern is consistent. The phrases travel with the paperwork, not with the calculations that precede it. What this reveals is not reverence for antiquity, but a practical requirement. Once authority is distributed across software, contractors, and remote sensors, participants need a compact vocabulary that still sounds like deliberate choice. The maxims meet that need without demanding that anyone verify whether the choice was ever actually made.
A submarine commander running a fighting withdrawal through the Lombok Strait does not know, in the moment, whether she is buying time for a larger fleet engagement or simply prolonging a loss that has already been decided elsewhere. The distinction is conferred retrospectively by strategists with access to the full record. The text is silent on this distinction. That is the final problem. A principle that cannot distinguish between victory and noble defeat is not a tool for strategy. It is an instrument of memory. The worth of a strategic choice is never found in its phrasing. It is measured by what it allows a specific person in a specific place to build or to save. Travel south from here to Vietnam's Mekong Delta. Go to Ben Tre province, where for generations the wealth was not in rice, but in coconuts, which can tolerate a degree of salt. The enemy here is the South China Sea, which pushes further up the river channels each year, poisoning the soil. The central government in Hanoi has a strategy, Resolution 120, a master plan for adapting the entire delta. It is full of phrases about turning weakness into opportunity. But on a small holding a few kilometers from the coast, a farmer I will call Levan An is conducting his own strategy. He knows the government plan advises shifting to shrimp farming, which he cannot afford, or to new salt-tolerant grapefruits, which he has never grown. The enemy he can measure is the salinity of the water in his well, which he tastes each morning. His terrain is the yellowing fringe on the leaves of his oldest coconut palms. His strategy is not in a document. It is in a graft. This afternoon, he will take a cutting from a new pomelo varietal and try to bind it to the rootstock of a dying tree. All war may be deception, but his hands are not deceiving anyone. They are looking for a way to live.
The epistemic mistake is this. We assume that because a text has survived translation across contexts, it must contain transferable content. But durability is not the same as portability, and neither guarantees utility. Consider the replication crisis in psychology. Between 2011 and 2015, the Open Science Collaboration attempted to replicate 100 published studies from 3 major journals. 64% failed to reproduce their original findings. The pattern was sharpest in studies with elegant quotable conclusions. Ego depletion makes self-control a finite resource. Power poses change hormone levels, precisely the kind of claim that travels well through TED Talks and management books. The studies that replicated were the ones with narrow, conditional findings that resisted being turned into maxims. The survival mechanism was identical to what we see with the art of war. An abstract claim, Willpower is like a muscle. Deception is the essence of strategy, is easier to remember, and harder to falsify than a conditional one. Know your enemy cannot be wrong because it specifies no threshold for what constitutes knowledge. Ego depletion occurs in laboratory conditions after sustained attention tasks, but does not reliably predict real-world self-control failures, is a claim you can test. It is also a claim no one quotes. The text's staying power is not evidence of deep structure. It is evidence of optimal mimetic design. A principle survives not because it guides action, but because it is consistent with any action you later decide to justify. That is not wisdom. That is the epistemological equivalent of a Rorschach blot. What the debate has exposed is that we have no shared test for distinguishing strategic principles from ritual language. The geographer's farmer survives through trial and inherited practice. The essayist's executives coordinate through shared vocabulary that masks calculation. Both call it strategy. Neither can say what evidence would prove them wrong. If we cannot tell the difference, we are not doing strategy. We are performing it.